good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming to this session on the use of body-worn cameras in regard to policing of domestic abuse incidents. And firstly, I'd like to start off by welcoming you all here today, thanking you for dropping in, and also to thank the N8 Policing Research Partnership for funding the project which I'm going to talk about, and to thank Adam and Oliver and colleagues for organising today and inviting me along to speak. So I'm going to talk about a research project which took place, I think, in the second tranche of small grants funding, so a couple of years or so ago now, which was undertaken with Dan Burns and Jose Pinar Sanchez from the University of Leeds. It's a collaborative project, as all the small grants projects were, and the forces involved in this project were West Yorkshire Police and Cumbria Police. So it's a relatively small scale project with two collaborating forces. So I'm going to try and share my screen now because I have a slideshow which hopefully will work. Okay, I hope you can all see that now. So I thought what I'd do is I'd flip the class and outline some of the, try and move this forward. There we go. Outline some of the guided questions at the start, and hopefully this will help with the discussion towards the end. So we'll be given some questions to think for us all to think about, which we can come to once I've gone through the presentation, which will last about 20 minutes. So just very briefly, if you could make a note of anything that surprised you or didn't surprise you in regard to any of the findings of the presentation. Likewise, if there's something that you feel is important, anything you'd like to take or you feel you will take from the presentation, and whether there's something that you've heard which might be relevant or most relevant for your work or your force or your practice. And also, I'd be really interested to hear if colleagues had any thoughts about what they see as the particular policy and practice challenges in this area of work. I will be flagging up some of the policy challenges which I think arise from the findings, but I'd be really interested to hear your views on that as well in the discussion. And finally, if colleagues have any thoughts on any further research which might be particularly useful in this area, then again, that would be really helpful to hear that in the discussion. So, briefly, the research, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. This is the structure of the discussion. So I'm going to outline the research context, say a little bit about the study, and talk about some of the perceived values of body-worn cameras as police officers saw them to be, then flag up some of the policy and practice implications, conclude, and then hopefully we'll have a useful discussion. So the research context, as we'll all be aware, over the last decade, we've seen quite a dramatic rollout of body-worn cameras across police forces in England and Wales. I believe that all police forces, all 43 forces now have some sort of body-worn camera capability, and latest estimations were that there's over 80,000 cameras in circulation amongst forces in England and Wales. Domestic abuse was identified as a key priority focus in regards to the rollout and use of body-worn cameras, and this is, I think, arises because of two primary reasons. Firstly, because of the priority given to vulnerability agenda and the high place of domestic abuse within the vulnerability agenda, and secondly, because of some of the well-known and recurring challenges around prosecuting domestic abuse cases. And we're all aware that there are very high rates of victim retraction in domestic abuse cases, and that may be linked to, well, maybe owing to victim withdrawal, maybe owing to non-attendance of the victim at court, and therefore body-worn cameras seem to have a potentially significant benefit in regard to producing effective evidence from the responding officers if they can get the initial account of the complainant on body-worn camera, and that was seen as being really valuable to taking forward successful prosecutions. And Steve Brooks mentioned the N8 PRP Police Innovation Forums this morning, and it was indeed at one of those early policing innovation forums that the HMIC FRS suggested that some research into body-worn cameras in this context would be really helpful, and that was what sort of underpinned and led to this research project. So just very briefly, the research had a couple of aims. We want to look at some of the challenges and opportunities that we felt arise for police in regard to the rollout of body-worn cameras in this context, and also to look at some of the what the outcomes. So in a sense, we were trying to do a process evaluation, looking at how the cameras were being used, and also an outcome evaluation, looking at some of the outcomes in terms of their effectiveness in terms of leading to better criminal justice process outcomes. I'm going to talk about the first of those today. So I'm talking specifically about some of the process issues. And just briefly, the way we did this was we held focus groups in both of the forces with about 45, I think, police officers. We interviewed officers who had responsibility for either domestic abuse or for body-worn cameras. And we also interviewed some senior lawyers from the 2 Crown Prosecution Service regions as well, covering the collaborative force areas. Before we get into the findings, just to flag that there were different contexts here within the 2 forces. So one of the forces had, West Yorkshire Police had seen significant recent investment in body-worn cameras. I think there were about 2,500 cameras in circulation in the force at the time of the research, whereas in Cumbria there were far fewer cameras. But in both forces, the cameras were allocated on pooled use, so they weren't personal issues. So equipment, so officers picked up the cameras at the start of each shift. And the model that, of the camera in both forces was that it was the officers were to turn the cameras on and off. So there was discretion of the officers to turn the cameras off, and they were mandated to do so as they arrived at a house where a domestic abuse call had been received. So they were asked to turn the cameras on as they entered the garden gate, so to speak. So what did we find? Firstly, I think it's important to note that there was a strong consensus around the benefits of body-worn cameras amongst the officers. This is maybe unsurprising, but I think what the officers told us is that whilst they were slightly guarded and cautious at first in regard to the rollout of the cameras, they began increasingly to see the cameras as a positive and useful bit of kit, as they called it. And I think a couple of reasons which we've flagged up, which came through from the research very strongly, is because of what we might term the occupational relevance of the cameras. In other words, the way in which they help officers to do their job well as they understand it to be. And I've categorized these 2 reasons here as, firstly, the cameras were seen to help officers with case building, to build a tight case, if you like, or to add to the evidence base in regard to a prosecution file. And secondly, they helped officers to what has been often referred to as avoiding in the job trouble. And I'll say a little bit more about that as we proceed later on, but I'm going to mainly talk about the case building and the way in which cameras might help develop a prosecution case. And just to say that the final point there is, you know, it may be an obvious point that there was consensus, but I think it's an important point to note, given what we know about the requirement for officers to implement policy, or their crucial role in the translation of policy into practice. So something about the perceived values of body-worn cameras, and this is quite well-worn territory. The officers told us about the extent to which they felt the cameras could provide impartial evidence, that the evidence that in terms of the recording of the footage of victims at a scene was particularly impactful if it, for instance, caught or recorded the complainant in an emotional upset, or if there was physical or material disturbances in the home, that the cameras could capture this more powerfully than officers merely writing notes up in their case files after the incident. Secondly, officers felt the cameras were really helpful because they were reviewable. And officers told us at times if they couldn't recall exactly what had happened at an incident, they might watch the body-worn video footage in order to help them with their recall of a situation, therefore to describe better in their case notes exactly what had happened as they saw it to be. And that point about the reviewability of the body-worn video footage, I think, is recurring throughout the criminal process. So interviewing detectives could consult the footage and use that when interviewing suspects. Evidential review officers could review it when making a decision on whether to take a case forward. Likewise, prosecution lawyers could access it, and so on and so forth, the judiciary, the magistrates and jurors. And I should add just a caveat there that is in theory, because there may be constraints around the extent to which courts can broadcast footage in courts. There may be constraints around the extent to which lawyers actually get to see body-worn video footage in time to make a decision, or prior to a case going to court, I should say. So the point is that the officers felt the video footage provided strong corroborating evidence to what the victim might have said at the time, but that it also could serve as a possibly as an admissible route for hearsay evidence, by which the evidence can go forward under the Re Gestae doctrine. That is whereby if a statement is made by someone who is judged to be in an emotionally overpowered, such an emotionally overpowered state that they couldn't possibly concoct or make up their story, that evidence might go forward, even if the victim withdrew their consent and withdrew their participation in the criminal justice process. And of course, this may this is decided upon by judges in each particular case, but it was seen as a way in which hearsay evidence could be made admissible within the court case. And as I say, the judge will decide that based upon the reliability of the evidence as he or she sees it to be. But I think it's worth flagging that the body-worn video footage is not strictly linear in its effects, and this was picked up by some of the officers in the interviews and the focus group. So what I mean by that is, in some circumstances, it may well be the case that video footage works in a way which shows inconsistencies between the complainant's initial account and their later statement. And of course, this may be something which a defence lawyer may seize upon in order to undermine the prosecution case. Equally, it might show complainants responding in ways that are contrary to socially prescribed expectations. So if an officer records a victim of a domestic abuse incident and the victim is not in, for instance, floods of tears and not showing, not responding in ways which we might expect, in other words, in a high emotionally traumatized state, then this might run contrary to an effective prosecution. And also, there's potential for adverse inferences arising from the absence of body-worn video footage, particularly if the footage becomes a normalized part of a prosecution case. What happens if a complainant refuses to be filmed and therefore there is no footage? Is that going to potentially undermine the prosecution case? Equally, you can well imagine that there are instances where the footage may be partial, where it's cut off halfway through, where the technology may fail, where there may be audio footage but not visual footage. So some of those technical issues and witness and complainant recording issues might potentially undermine the case. Some of the policy findings, just briefly. So I think the research raises questions about how officers should be trained to use body-worn cameras to conduct effective investigations. In other words, that they probably do need to have some training in what they should be doing to make sure that they're using the cameras in a proactive way, or not just a passive way, so that they are recording the sorts of things which might be useful for a prosecution case. Also, that officers might need to be trained in how they should respond to some of the situational contingencies that can arise at these incidents. So, for instance, officers are saying to us that they were unsure about what they should do if a victim, for instance, says that they don't want to be recorded by the officer on body-worn video footage. And I think there's varying policies here across the country. Some forces, for instance, are saying, suggest in their policy statements that officers should stop recording in those circumstances. Other forces say that they should continue to do so. And equally, the same applies if a complainant starts talking about allegations of sexual offences that they've experienced by the suspect as well. Also, I think the introduction of body-worn camera footage in the criminal process does raise partnership issues for how, for instance, particularly how the police and the Crown Prosecution Service are going to work together, such that evidence or footage is passed between the different organisations, how it's stored, how it's identified and edited, and done so in a time frame which is required given the pending court proceedings in many cases. I think there's also a really interesting issue around the role of body-worn camera in regard to victim-unsupported prosecutions. I've already mentioned about how the footage can be used can be used as admissible under the Ray Gestrine doctrine. And I think, you know, one of the challenges for police forces and the CPS is how they might seek to overcome what is often, I think, seen as a sort of tendency to fall back on the no further action. So actually, how do forces, how do they move forward on using this footage in cases where victims have withdrawn or don't turn up at court? And this raises lots of interesting and quite challenging questions around victims' autonomy and the extent to which, you know, a case should go forward when the victim wants to withdraw their consent or doesn't want to participate in the criminal process. And I think the point here which I would make is that I think, you know, there should be some principles that come to play here around the criteria by which a case does proceed on that basis or not. And I think there is probably scope here for some sort of national policy to try and govern this area and introduce some sort of principled and standardized approach to when a victim unsupported case should or should not go forward. I think also there are policy issues around what, and particular training issues around what responding officers need to do in anticipation of victim unsupported prosecutions. So they could be directed in what they should film, when they should film, who they should film, what they should seek to ask. If they account of the complainant at the incident, it is going to be useful for taking forward one of these prosecutions. At the same time, and conversely, I think it's important that officers are given some training guidance around what they need to know in order not to jeopardize the possibility of such cases. So, for instance, not issuing leading questions at a crime scene such that that undermines the possibility of that case being used in evidence at court. I mentioned also how the officers liked the footage because it helped them, it gave them some confidence. And what I've called there is around, it gave them some confidence that they could do their job and that the footage might back them up if there were contentious decisions made. But I think the flip side of that is that body-worn cameras might also have some potentially deleterious effects on officers' decisions, on their actions, on their words, particularly if officers feel there is that what happened at a particular crime scene is going to be scrutinised. So what I've described there as the need to avoid accountability syndromes, because sometimes, as I'm sure many officers in the room would tell us, there's a need for decisions to be based upon police discretion and not ultimately driven by mechanical and legalistic type rule-based decisions. Officers often need to use authority. They might use their authority to control a situation. And likewise, at times, officers will need to use force in dealing with incidents. And some of the officers were saying about how they were slightly worried about the recording of their actions at these scenes might cast them in a negative light. The second point there just follows on from this is that it's important to recognise that good policing is subject to situational competencies, and that there's a need for a pragmatic need to fit conduct to context. In other words, some circumstances, some situations may need quite what officers often call robust policing responses, which might not look appropriate on film, but which officers felt were required at the time. And also, I think it's important that officers are able to maintain a victim-focused response. And so there's a bit of a caveat there. If officers are thinking about what they're filming and having to film things, the extent to which this distracts them from having a more focus or in the moment focus on responding and attending to the victim or the complainant at a particular incident. So just by way of conclusion, officers felt that the cameras were a really helpful tool in safeguarding complainants and victims, that it helped them bring a more effective prosecution case file together to pass on to the CPS, and that it would do a benefit, in particular, the progression of victim unsupported prosecutions, albeit that I've suggested that there are some issues there which we might want to think about as body-worn cameras become more and more embedded and rolled out within response policing. And the flip side is the potential to impinge on victim autonomy, as I've mentioned, and of course, if you know, it's particularly sensitive issues raised by domestic abuse and the idea of taking forward victim unsupported prosecutions, particularly in the extent to which this might raise risks for the complainant if a case goes forward, which they had reported at the time, but which they then withdrew their support for. And I think there is a difficult balancing act there to be had. Just finally, I think what came through also quite strongly from the research was the extent to which the effectiveness of body-worn cameras is to a large extent, or to a significant extent, I should say, contingent upon whether officers could get to a scene in the so-called golden hour and therefore gain footage of a complainant at the moment when they're in crisis and at the moment when they are most likely to cooperate with the police. And if officers are unable to record footage at the scene in the so-called golden hour, then the prospect of prosecution declines markedly. Secondly, the role of body-worn cameras in cases of coercive control. Officers didn't really say too much about the extent to which they were using the cameras in cases of coercive control, and this may be because they associate the cameras with more incident-based tasks rather than crisis calls rather than a coercive control, which is seen more as a process of ongoing coercion and oppression of the complainant. So body-worn cameras seem to be a useful evidential tool, but not to detract from the need for victim engagement, ongoing support. And I think, you know, that came through very clearly from the research, that whilst the cameras can be really helpful in terms of providing corroborative evidence, that this shouldn't distract from the wider needs of victim support throughout the criminal process. Thank you, and I'm happy to open it up for discussions, and I shall firstly try to close down my screen. So, do we have any first responses to the findings? Who would like to start? Do we know the success rate of projected success of getting a prosecution with the use of the footage? No, we don't. I mean, in regard to this research, we couldn't find a strong causal link between the presence of video footage and the prosecutions, and this is, you know, it's a difficult area to research because it involves the cross-checking across different databases, and there wasn't always the availability of the data that we needed in order to do any kind of robust outcomes measurement in this area. But generally, in terms of other research studies, I mean, it's a varied picture. There is some evidence from US context that that the cameras do have an effect on leading to more successful prosecutions, and I can point colleagues out to that research after the presentation if you want to see it. Any other thoughts or questions on this research or the wider issues around the use of body-worn cameras?
So there's just to bring to your attention, Stuart, there was just a question underneath the last one. So is there an issue with officers writing statements using body-worn video to jog their memory? Do they write statements that fit the video rather than their memory? Other witnesses don't have such access to a memory aid.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, because in the context of complaints by members of the public, I know the guidance, I think, from the College of Policing is that officers shouldn't they shouldn't do that. They shouldn't look at the footage in order to jog their memory, that they should, you know, write a response, produce a written response in the first place, and that's in order so that, as the question raises there, that victims or the complainant doesn't have that advantage. But I think the College of Policing guidance is based on the idea that a written statement will be more authentic in terms of allowing officers to reflect upon the situation, how they felt, and the justification for what happened at the time. In regard to domestic abuse and what the officers told us, there wasn't anything coming through from the interviews on that. So I'm unsure how they were directed on that basis, but they did say that they did use the footage from time to time in order to help them jog their memory, as you put it, and write up the case notes. But I think it does raise questions, yes. Nairi makes a point. I think that they will be interested in the role footage plays in achieving evidence-based prosecutions where the victim doesn't support the prosecution. you want to comment on that point, Nairi?
Yes, Stuart, I've just written the body-worn video policy for Merseyside Police, actually. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
So in answer to the question above, we advise that officers do look at the footage before writing their statement. And that is from experience of writing statements that then have little inconsistencies that get made into big issues in the courtroom. So that is advised now. But in terms of, I think, in terms of evidence-led prosecutions, I think it would be really interesting to see whether body-worn video footage has an influence on actually getting charges authorised, because that's where the drop-off is. The NFA is where the CPS decide there's not sufficient to charge. And I think with the increase in body-worn, it would be really interesting to know the impact footage is having on that decision making, and would be achievable, because it's hard to say what impact it has on all DV prosecutions because there's so many different factors.
No, I would agree with you, Nairi, and I think the way in which police and CPS are working together, or not working together, as the case may be, in this specific space is significant, and I think there is scope for further work there. And I think there are examples of forces in effect sending the footage over to CPS just via I think via physical devices, and I think Cheshire Police were developing a cloud-based system whereby the footage could be, the digital footage could be relayed much more effectively and efficiently, and securely as well. So I think there is scope to look at this and see what's going on a much broader scale than this research project could do.
Well, I think COVID has increased the speed of that development, to be honest. So we can now share footage.
Yeah.
Hi Stuart, it's Karen Byram from Cheshire Constabulary. Thank you for your presentation. I found that really interesting. One of the things that we're struggling with, although we have made developments in that sharing of footage, is actually the decision to save footage and keep it, and policy decisions around only uploading it if it holds evidential value to the case. And I think some further work around evidential value and the meaning of that, and how previous footage or other types of evidence could be used in terms of course of conduct investigations, where we look for consistencies in order to progress cases in the future, with a lot of obviously domestic abuse offences incidents being repeats, especially in the stalking harassment environment that we're in terms of crime recording. So I think from our perspective, there's a bit around what is actually the red tape in terms of it. We can't store everything because of cost. So how do we frame our policies to be cost effective and also not harm us in terms of evidential value in the future?
Yeah, because I think that's it's an important issue. I think isn't it the case that routinely forces can keep the footage 31 days?
Yeah.
And,
but they
and
may
how
upload. They may. I think there's things around upload, adding to files, and whether to upload, and how much of a file to upload. And I think we've come a cropper with, giving officers the ability to, crop video, edit, and get the right screens. And we needed another 5 minutes, and we wanted the bit around the offence as well, and all that sort of education and links in with the CPS and those relationships, in order so, like Nairi's just said, we're not walking ourselves straight into what will be a defence argument around not having enough footage.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The situation may be very different in across the country, across different forces. But I suppose one of the concerns is well, the focus initially on training, I think, was on the sort of the technological and some of the procedural issues around the use of technology. And I think that's understandable, because of course you want officers to know how to use, you know, the technology firstly. But I think, as I'm trying to suggest, you know, I think we now need to be probably a bit more sophisticated, if you like, and actually, you know, training officers in what they should do with the technology and how they should, you know, how they should respond to the fact that, you know, they are actually under surveillance from this device, as well as, you know, the members of the public. And so, for instance, how should officers respond to any given situation that they come across? And, you know, obviously there are a myriad of situations that they do come across, but, you know, if some guidance could be given to them, as I say, for instance, if a victim just point blank refuses to cooperate because they're being filmed, what officers should do in those situations, and what officers should, you know, what are the specific things that they should be looking to record, what things should they be asking in anticipation, if you like, of the a case going forward without the support of a victim. I'm just reading this now. What are the victim's rights in not consenting to be filmed? Well, as I've tried to allude to, forces act differently upon that issue in terms of what their policy guidance to officers, or their policy prescription to officers. So some forces, as I say, will say that the victim's rights not to be filmed have to be respected. And as I understand it, there are other forces which say that the officers should continue to be filmed, to film. And you know, it is clearly a contentious issue, which has been brought about directly by the introduction of the cameras in these incidents. I don't know if the colleague who asked that question wants to come in. I've spoken to officers who have 180 minutes of body-worn video footage from a DV case, and CP have asked us to edit for them. Yeah, well, again, there are a lot of those sorts of issues arising. You know, digital technology is intended to make things work more efficiently, but actually it can raise specific, you know, quite arduous tasks for some upon colleagues working for different agencies. So that editing task, you know, is you know, can be quite a significant one, and somebody has to do it. Any other thoughts, reflections on the presentation, or any of the issues that it raises? As I say, the research did bring up many of the sort of, you know, issues which are recurring and really challenging to deal with, particularly in regard to how the victim's behaviour or the complainant's behaviour at an incident might influence police officers' behaviours and actions. It raised the issues around how there may be stereotypical expectations of victims' behaviours. So lots of issues that came up in the research, which, as I say, chime with some, you know, mainstream recurrent findings of criminological research. there may be a mismatch between response officer training and investigative training, which requires good working knowledge of evidence change, points to prove in terms of investigative interviewing. I think that's right, and that's the point I was trying to suggest, that if the complainant's account recorded at the scene is to be used as sound evidence in a court trial, then it seems to me the officers conducting that investigation, doing that recording, do need to have some degree of expert knowledge, such that they don't undermine their own case. So I think that's a valid point. It comes back to this point about maybe forces now having to, or the College of Policing indeed, having to think a bit more, a bit further about how officers should be trained in regard to getting the best and most out of this tool for their own purposes in terms of successful prosecutions. Did anybody have any thoughts upon the issue around what criteria ought to be applied when making decisions to take forward a so-called victim unsupported prosecution? Or indeed what happens currently in their own force area around now and CPS area? Because it seems to me we probably do need to have some degree of consistency in the decision-making process here, which can only be brought about by some sort of stated principles or criteria as to how these decisions are made. Nairi, can I ask you, in regard to drafting up the body-worn video footage policy in your own force, are you able to say, what were some of the really thorny challenges that you felt this area of work produced in terms of drafting local policy?
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I think there is real conflict. There's conflict between investigation who want lots of body, frontline officers who don't know what to do with all the images they get, and then
I think we've lost Nairi there.
Yes, it looks like we lost Neri there. I just wanted to highlight, there was a question in regards to a copy of the slides from the presentation. We will have more information for all of the participants later this week in regards to materials, etc. And it looks like Neri's back here now.
you
You just dropped out a bit then, Nairi. Do you want to try again?
Yeah, I was just going to say it. Yeah, I don't think my.
Yeah, you're dropping in and out a bit there, Nairi. We'll have to pick up the conversation.
I don't think I've got good enough connection.
I can hear you now.
I was going to say the difficulty is it is our responsibility to present the prosecution file, and so if you've got lots and lots of images, you do have to cut them and identify what is evidential. And that's really why we had to write a new policy, to try and give clarity about how to prepare a prosecution file when you can have hours and hours of images. I think the ethical question about whether you should you should do a prosecution when the victim doesn't support it, I think we haven't really referred to that, and it's something that's considered by the CPS, but probably does need more thought with partner agencies and victims themselves. But all these images have made it much more difficult to prepare a prosecution file, and that's really why we've had to rewrite our policy to help officers understand how to present it as evidence.
Thank you for that. But when you say it's made it more difficult, can you explain that a bit further?
It's just that you have to disclose all the evidence you've got, but you've got to identify where the evidential bit is. So if you've got 5 officers who all turn on their body-worn video on the way to an incident and then don't turn it off until the end, you have hours and hours of images, and you've got to cut and clip and exhibit them for them to be fit for a prosecution file.
Yeah.
So it's created, you know, a skill that officers now need to have that they didn't used to need to have.
Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts or reflections on either discussion points or the findings of the study? Okay, well, I'm happy to leave it at that then, and just to thank you for your participation. If you do want to get in touch with me about the study or the findings, then please do so. I did post the presentation and the findings from the research somewhere on the platform. I'm hoping they're available somewhere, but either way, you can contact me, and I'm happy to send you the findings of the study or the presentation. Okay, thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you.